attends quelque chose, Michel?
Hein?
Tu attends quelque chose? Simplement dire
Ah bon, c'est là-bas que ça va se passer?
Non, non, c'est ici, mais c'est la présentation d'abord officielle.
Et après, vous allez...
On arrête pour une minute pour que les gens qui vont parler, que ce soit
Ah
ici.
bon, alors, d'accord,
Oui.
on commence.
On commence.
Est-ce qu'on peut commencer? Can we begin?
Essentially on epistemological questions. How do we know the reality of the famine, and how do we analyze it? The workshop should focus ideally on methodological, conceptual questions, as well as sources, written and oral, as well as the historiography. James Mace is a specialist on two topics: the policy of Ukrainization, as well as the famine. The book on Ukrainization will be out shortly, and the second book dealing with the famine is in progress. He is an associate of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Donc on va commencer avec Monsieur Mace, puis on va toucher le sujet du recensement et puis l'historiographie, et je veux dire question de source orale. So we'll start first of all with James Mace's general presentation on sources.
Thank you. Upon hearing our discussions, any person hitherto unfamiliar with the subject might be expected to ask, how could something of this magnitude have happened and I never heard of it? The question is not only a legitimate one, but I would be rather suspicious of anybody who failed to ask it. As historians, it is our particular duty to ask it. However, the question really consists in two separate questions. One deals with concealment. The other and more basic question, however, is the expression of healthy skepticism. Did this really happen? What do we know about it? How do we know what we know? This last question of epistemology is a question which it is every historian's duty to ask, and it is my task here to try to provide an answer. As every reader of Agatha Christie knows, murder is easy. The challenge is not to get caught. To give the devil his due, Stalin showed himself to be a master of the art of concealment. Well, how do we catch him? By following, first of all, the clues that he himself left us. The single most important source for the study of the Ukrainian famine is the Soviet-Ukrainian press of the period. This might seem a bit surprising to anyone who's picked up one of these newspapers, because he is immediately struck by the fact that the press was itself a means of concealment and propaganda. Day after day, one sees smiling peasants who cannot wait to join the collective farm and take part in the happy life being offered there. Yet, even the most tightly controlled press has to provide something other than mere propaganda. If the system is to function, the press must be used also as a way to channel information, orders, and intimidation. Otherwise, a press would hardly be necessary, for a few dozen propaganda leaflets would do quite as well. It is possible to trace the policies which produced the famine through the press in a number of ways. First of all, the policies which created the famine were, for the most part, announced in the daily newspapers in the texts of decrees. We've mentioned earlier the Chornodoshka, the blacklisting of villages, their economic blockade, and its main features, which were described in Vystivye UCVK, the Ukrainian counterpart of Izvestia, on December 8, 1932. One also encounters draconian measures against the slaughter of livestock, measures which would hardly have been necessary if livestock were not being slaughtered. Then there are day in and day out reports of what are called kulak sabotage and resistance, editorials demanding that resolute measures be employed and those responsible obtain more grain in the manner appropriate to Bolsheviks. There are denunciations of opportunists and local party organizations who, quote, do not want to see the kulaks in their midst, and threats against such opportunists in the form of penalties imposed upon those whose Bolshevik resolve was found wanting. The progress of the procurements campaign was followed daily. A whole mythology was created to explain that which was not mentioned, the fact that practically every newspaper reader confronted dead bodies at every turn. There were difficulties, as they were called, because kulaks, as they were called, were concealing grain, and it was the duty of every good Soviet citizen to uncover this grain and deliver it to the state. Those who did not want to see the kulaks were opportunists. In reality, since dekulakization had taken place at the end of 1929, beginning of 1930, we can sympathize with those so-called opportunists who did not want to see kulaks, because they were the same people who had shipped the kulaks off to Siberia quite a number of months earlier. In short, the discerning reader, even one removed from the scene in time and place, could get a fairly good rough idea of what was going on just by reading the newspapers. Second, we are extremely fortunate to have the admissions of the Khrushchev period. Here, however, we encounter a new myth. Grave errors were committed due to the cult of personality, i.e. Stalin, whose name had by then become unmentionable. And only the Leninist core of the party, presumably led by Khrushchev, kept things from getting even worse. In the early 1960s, historians began to admit that there had been what they called serious distortions and a grave situation connected with a severe shortfall of edible produce caused by a poor harvest and incorrect planning of the grains procurement campaign. Well, since they also published figures on the harvest at this time, and those figures were compared with those of the late 20s, when the harvest was even lower than it was during the famine, we can, to a certain extent, discount the figure of the factor of a shortfall in the harvest as actually producing famine conditions. The point is that you do have these backhanded methods of admission that something took place. However, no one was ever able to admit the extent of the famine, although a number of fiction writers were able to go rather far in showing the negative side of collectivization. That is, what the people were like who actually carried out these policies. The village drunks, the village good-for-nothings. And mostly this type of material has been published in the Russian journal Nash Sovremennik, which is, as you know, published in Moscow. After Khrushchev, Soviet scholars had to become a bit more reticent, although one occasionally encountered euphemistic reference to the famine as late as well into the 1970s. The demographer V.I. Kozlov, for example, wrote as late as 1975 in reference to the rather marked decline in the number of Kazakhs and Ukrainians between 1926 and 1939, quote, "Thus the decline of livestock in Kazakhstan in 1930 and the harvest failure of 1932 in Ukraine probably produced a very temporary rise in the mortality rate." Well, this is a masterpiece of understatement. Other historians described the failed harvest of 1932 as larger than that of the worst years under the NEP when nobody starved. Now, when it comes to the extent of the famine, we are left with the Soviet censuses. For a firm estimate of the number of victims, we are forced to rely either on unofficial Soviet estimates made off the record or the really highly unsatisfactory census of 1939. Of Soviet unofficial estimates, 10 million is the number most often encountered. And a Soviet-Ukrainian poet has even been reported as attributing the figure to a secret document of the CPBU Central Committee. He made this statement in 1956 at a meeting of the Union of Soviet Writers in Ukraine. Even if we assume this figure to be accurate, and we do have the information only at third hand, it is difficult to see how the officials could have kept an accurate count of the dead. Now, an attempt was made to do so by prohibiting unregistered burials, but a large number of eyewitnesses tell us that the village inhabitants took the attitude that the dead were not even afraid of the secret police, and they went ahead and buried their dead themselves, without the formalities of registration. Photographs of signs prohibiting burials in public parks confirm that this is in fact what occurred. Since the figure of 10 million resurfaced as early as 1935, it was obviously not based on census data, and we have this figure from two early sources. First of all, Adam Taldul, who was of either Russian or Ukrainian origin. It's really not clear, but his father had been a member of the Bolshevik Party. He himself became a communist, was educated as an engineer here, and in 1930 went back to the Soviet Union. His father, interestingly enough, had been a part of the Bolshevik underground and had hidden Skripnik out on one of his escapes from Siberia. Well, knowing Skripnik, Taldul was able to move in some of the highest circles socially in Soviet Ukraine, and according to him, he published this after coming back out in 1935. Skripnik had told him before his suicide that 8 to 9 million people had perished in Soviet Ukraine and the North Caucasus. another 1 to 2 million in the Volga region. And Belitsky, the head of the Ukrainian KGB, or rather the GPU at the time, is said to have confirmed this. The other place where the 10 million figure surfaces very early is that of William Horsley Gant. And Gant was a very prominent psychiatrist in Great Britain. He was in the Soviet Union studying with Pavlov in the 1930s, and he asked Pavlov, or rather he had discussions with Soviet public health officials, and they told him that probably 10 million people died. A few of them said it might even have been as high as 15 million. Well, that's where these figures come from. You can take them for what they're worth. What we are really left with, however, is the census of 1939. Now, Dr. Babyonyshev is going to tell us how he's extrapolated on the basis of this census an absolute minimum figure of 4.5 million persons who died prematurely in Soviet Ukraine. This is, I think, probably somewhat below the actual figure. For one thing, it's based on the total number of inhabitants in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and there are numerous accounts of Russian settlers being brought in to repopulate depopulated Ukrainian villages, as well as accounts of Ukrainians succeeding in escaping Soviet Ukraine during the famine to try to make a living elsewhere in the USSR. There's no figures to help us gain an idea of a balance between these two migration processes. The problem with the 1939 census is quite simply the 1937 census. If those who prepared the census in 1937 were shot for having found too many people, which is precisely what happened, and it was reported in Pravda and Izvestia in 1937 that these people were, that the preparers of the 1937 census were exposed as counter-revolutionary saboteurs who were trying to discredit the idea of socialism in one country by deliberately undercounting the number of people in the Soviet Union. Now, the people who prepared the census in 1939 were well aware of what had happened to their predecessors. They read the newspaper, and it is logical to assume that they were eager to prevent the perception of similar shortcomings in their own work. I mean, after all, nobody wants to get shot. Well, even on the basis of this census, we have a comparison between Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. And if we compare Belarusians with Ukrainians, we find the Belarusians culturally almost identical to the Ukrainians, subject to the same assimilatory pressures, increased 11.5% during the relevant period, while Ukrainians dropped 10%. The Ukrainians, we can therefore assume, should have increased well over 20% rather than dropping 10%. This gives us a ballpark estimate of perhaps 5 to 7 million people who died. And this is admittedly a crude comparison, and it could well be an understatement because of the circumstances surrounding the 39 census. As far as we know, the estimates of 10 million might well prove to be correct. Information has come out on the 1937 census, originating, as far as I know, with a KGB defector, or actually an NKVD defector named Walter Kravitsky, and his story was published by Boris Suvarin in his biography of Stalin in 1939. And according to Kravitsky, the 1937 census found only 147 million people living in the Soviet Union. Quite a damaging estimate because they estimated quite a few more would be there. And Kravitsky estimated that the 39 census, or predicted the 39 census, would show at least 170 million people. Well, the 39 census ended up showing 170.5 million people, so I guess we can say that the 39 census preparers overfulfilled their quota by 500,000. Well, the censuses are much more reliable in determining the territorial extent of the famine, and Dr. Babyonyshev is also going to talk, I understand, a little bit about that and what he's done using the age tables of rural females in the 1959 census. Now, while the Soviet sources give us valuable evidence, in all a fairly good but rough picture of what took place, it is quite enough to start with, but it is hardly enough to be satisfied with, and for this reason we have to then move on to the non-Soviet sources. Now, reliable Western observers witnessed the famine and wrote about what they saw. While a number of Western correspondents actively aided Stalin in concealing the famine, there were those who did not. Of those who who denied that the famine was taking place. Walter Durante is probably the most outstanding example. On the other side of the coin, there's Malcolm Muggeridge, who was then the correspondent of the Manchester Guardian, and William Henry Chamberlain, correspondent of the Christian Science Monitor, both of whom reported accurately what they saw, and soon after leaving the Soviet Union, publishing books about it. Thomas Walker published in the often and deservedly maligned Hearst newspaper chain. The term yellow journalism was coined in reference to the Hearst papers. Published an outstanding, if rather sensationalistic account, accompanied by some of the best photographs of the famine available anywhere. The most discerning of those who observed the famine and wrote about it was probably Ewald Amende, Secretary General of the European Council of Nationalities and the League of Nation official most intimately concerned with national problems in interbellum Europe. Amende probably came closest of the observers of the day to a full understanding of the famine and its implications for the national structure of the Soviet Union. His book was originally published in German as Russland Hungern in Vienna in 1935. A sometimes less than adequate translation into English was published the following year as Human Life in Russia. We would expect that the fullest coverage of the famine would be given in the non-Soviet Ukrainian press, and here we are not disappointed. Perhaps the best coverage was found in Dilo, the most important Ukrainian language daily published in interbellum Poland, and they had articles on the famine every single day. The famine was also extensively covered in the North American Ukrainian language press, especially in the American Svoboda and such Canadian papers as Nowy Szlak and Ukraiński Holos. Information was also collected at this time by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Of foreign governments, Germany had the best information thanks to the fact that it maintained consulates in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Chernihiv. The three German consuls estimated that in their areas, which contained a total population of about 12 million, about 2.5 million had died. If we extend this to the entire population of Soviet Ukraine, the figure would thus become about 6.25 million dead for the Republic as a whole. We also have the testimony of those who took part in the regime which perpetrated the famine. Khrushchev alludes to the famine in his unofficial memoirs. His testimony is at second hand, but is still rather valuable considering the source. Khrushchev reports the following conversation that Mikoyan had related to him. Quote, Mikoyan told me that Comrade Demchenko, who was then first secretary of the Kiev Regional Committee, once came to see him in Moscow. Here's what Demchenko said. Anastas Ivanovich, does Comrade Stalin, for that matter, does anyone in the Politburo know what's happening in the Ukraine? Well, if not, I'll give you some idea. A train recently pulled into Kiev loaded with the corpses of people who had starved to death. It picked up corpses all the way from Poltava to Kiev. That is from Khrushchev himself. Yurko Stepovy, a former Soviet journalist who covered the visit of the former French Prime Minister Edouard Herriot to Ukraine at the height of the famine, is of particular value in explaining how the famine could be successfully concealed. According to Stepovy, actors were outfitted in peasant costumes and given bread rolls to display as the former Prime Minister came through. Others came through various points. Others tell about the repainting of entire streets down which area was scheduled to go, and of raids on the lines outside the commercial bread shops, where anyone swollen was seized, put on a train, and hauled into a pit outside of town. Those with the strength crawled out, and those who lacked the strength remained there. Among the perpetrators of the famine, we also have the testimony of Lev Koplev, the model of the communist idealist Rudin in Solzhenitsyn's novel The First Circle. Koplev devotes a chapter of his memoir, The Education of a True Believer, originally published in Russian as I Satvoril Себе Kumira, to the Ukrainian famine and his participation in it as an idealistic young communist sent into the village to procure grain. The most forthcoming memoir, however, is that of Viktor Kravchenko, I Chose Freedom. Kravchenko, the former Soviet trade official who defected to the United States at the end of the Second World War, was sent into the countryside in 1930 to help carry out collectivization. During the famine, he was in the city, but he still reports a great deal about his encounters with the starving and with the orphaned Bezprizorny. Kravchenko's memoir is also unique in that it has a sort of legal sanction. After the French Communist Party organ, La Lettre Française, accused him of lying in his book, Kravchenko sued the paper for libel. After a trial which turned into a cause célèbre, and at which a number of Soviet officials testified for the defense and famine survivors for the plaintiff, Kravchenko was awarded the symbolic damages of 1 franc by the court. A second book based on the trial and containing eyewitness testimony on the famine was published as I Chose Justice. The tragedy of the famine cannot, however, be understood in any sense unless it is through the testimony of those who survived it. There is a great deal of eyewitness material of this type recorded, but still rather little in comparison with what remains to be done. The Democratic Association of Ukrainians formerly repressed by the Soviets, Dobrus, published an outstanding 2-volume collection of eyewitness accounts in 1953 and 1955 under the rather emotional title of The Black Deeds of the Kremlin. Dobrus, which had split off from Dobrus in the early 50s, published a valuable Ukrainian language pamphlet of eyewitness accounts in 1951 as Найбільші злочин Кремля. Yuri Semenko published another Ukrainian language collection in 1963 as the year 1933 in Ukraine. Oleksiy Voropai's 1954 The Ninth Circle combines what he himself saw with what he heard from others. Also, a large number of individual memoirs of various types by survivors were collected in the early 1950s by the Harvard University Refugee Interview Project. This, I think, is extremely valuable because the Harvard Project was not in the least interested in the famine. They didn't ask any questions about it. These accounts were collected were all collected in the course of general life history interviews. And after a while, there's an indication in the transcripts that the interviewers got so tired of hearing these stories that they would turn off the recorder and just indicate in parentheses that they became very, very sympathetic at this time, but they had, after a while, heard it all before. To conclude, we historians are above all detectives. It is the challenge and the curse of our lot that we have the task of assembling a puzzle in which many of the most important pieces are missing. We have gathered many of the pieces, but we cannot be satisfied so long as there is one recoverable bit of information still awaiting discovery. We will differ on how to fit the pieces together, but collecting and assembling it is our duty. We owe it to those who perished, to those who survived, and most of all, we owe it to that elusive ideal which we call the truth.
Thank you. We'll now